Emily sat beside the man, the book of poetry resting lightly in her hands. She read aloud, her voice soft yet unwavering, filling the sterile hospital room with a warmth it hadn't known in years. The patient, once distant, unresponsive, now flicked his eyes toward her in recognition, the faintest sign of life returning to his tired gaze. But tonight, something was different. The air in the hospital was heavy, the whispers of nurses carrying an unspoken tension. As Emily turned the page, the door creaked open. A tall man in a dark suit entered without knocking. His presence was imposing, unwelcome. Behind him, two more men followed, one carrying a folder, the other standing stiffly like security. "Miss Reynolds," the first man said smoothly, ignoring the patient entirely. "We need to speak with you." Emily frowned. "I'm in the middle of something," she replied, gripping the book a little tighter. The man glanced at the patient, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure this can wait." Emily set the book down, her jaw tightening. "What is this about?" The man's smirk was subtle, almost imperceptible. "Come with us," he said, not as a request, but as an order. She followed them down the hallway, her heart pounding. The air was thick with something she couldn't name, danger, perhaps. Humiliation. They led her into a private office, where a woman in a pristine white coat waited, her hands folded over a clipboard. "We need to address a concern," the doctor said, not looking up. "It seems you've taken an excessive personal interest in one of our long-term patients." Emily blinked. "Excessive?" The suited man, now leaning against the wall, spoke. "Miss Reynolds, you have been here every night, staying beyond your shifts, reading, bringing gifts. Flowers, books. Do you understand how that might look?" Emily's stomach twisted. "I'm just trying to help," she said, her voice steady. "He has no family. No visitors. That's not your place," the doctor interrupted, her voice cool. "This is a medical facility, not a personal charity." Emily felt a chill creep down her spine. "Are you saying kindness is against protocol?" The man chuckled. "I'm saying perception matters." Emily had seen this before. She had felt it before, the way people like this wielded power with a smile, as if their cruelty was just another bureaucratic necessity. "You're implying something," she said, her pulse loud in her ears. "So why don't you just say it?" The room fell silent. Finally, the doctor set down the clipboard and leaned forward. "Some of the staff believe you might be overly attached. That your presence might be more about your own emotional needs than the patient's well-being." Emily stared at them, the words sinking in like ice. Overly attached. Emotional needs. They were making her sound unprofessional. Desperate. Humiliating her. She clenched her fists, breathing through the sting of it. "So what are you suggesting? That I stop visiting? That I let him rot alone in that bed?" The doctor sighed. "We are simply advising boundaries, Miss Reynolds. Otherwise, we will have to reevaluate your position here." There was the unspoken threat. She was disposable to them. Her kindness was inconvenient. Emily looked at the three of them, the doctor, the suit, the silent observer in the corner, all watching her like she was a problem they needed to fix. She forced a breath, steadying herself. "Understood," she said flatly. She left the room without another word. But as she walked down the hallway, passing the rooms filled with people who had no one, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Emily walked back to the patient's room, her hands shaking, her stomach twisting with anger. They had humiliated her. Not just questioned her professionalism, but made it sound like she was pathetic, some fragile woman clinging to a patient for emotional validation. She pushed open the door gently. He was still there, his frail body resting under the thin hospital sheets, his breath shallow but steady. His eyes flicked toward her, and for the first time, there was something new there. Concern. "They spoke to you, didn't they?" she murmured, forcing a small smile as she sat beside him again. A slow nod. Emily exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down her face. "They think I'm doing too much. That I'm here for the wrong reasons." The pause. Then, with great effort, his fingers twitched against the blanket, as if reaching for her hand but stopping just short. She swallowed hard. He didn't need to say anything. She understood. She wasn't going to stop. The next day, the tension was worse. It started small. A few nurses whispering when she walked by. A doctor, one who had always been polite before, barely looking at her as he handed off a clipboard. Then came the real humiliation. Emily. A sharp voice called her name in the hallway. She turned. It was Dr. Whitmore, one of the higher-ups. And standing beside him was a woman she hadn't seen before, a hospital administrator in a crisp navy suit, her eyes cold and assessing. "We need to speak in private." Her stomach twisted. But before she could step away with them, Dr. Whitmore simply crossed his arms and continued, right there, in the middle of the hallway, in front of other staff. "There's been a complaint." Emily's breath caught. "A complaint?" The administrator nodded. "Concerns have been raised about your approach with certain patients?" A few heads turned. The hospital had never been silent before, but now, in this moment, it felt like every set of eyes was on her. Her throat tightened. "What concerns?" Dr. Whitmore didn't even flinch. "That you might be making some patients uncomfortable. That your attachment could be perceived as inappropriate." There was that word again. Inappropriate. A cold rage settled in her chest. She knew what this was. She wasn't stupid. The patient she cared for, he wasn't like the others. He was black, elderly, without family. A man most of the staff ignored. And here she was, a white nurse, showing too much concern, staying too long, treating him like he mattered. And that made them uncomfortable. Because people like him weren't supposed to be seen. They were supposed to fade away, invisible, unnoticed. Emily clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palm. She could feel the humiliation creeping up her neck, burning her face. They wanted to make an example of her. She could stay quiet, apologize, promise to adjust her behavior. She straightened her spine. "Tell me," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "Did the patient himself complain? Or is this just the hospital deciding what's best for him?" A flicker of surprise crossed the administrator's face. Dr. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's irrelevant." "No," Emily said firmly. "It's not." Silence. Because they knew. The complaint didn't come from him. It came from the ones who never saw him at all. Emily let the silence stretch before she spoke again, voice unwavering. "I'll keep doing my job," she said, looking Whitmore in the eye. "And if my care makes anyone uncomfortable, they can come tell me themselves." Then she turned and walked away, leaving them standing there. But as she passed the patient's room, she saw something that made her stop. His eyes were open. And for the first time, there was something fierce in them. He had heard everything. And for the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting. And so was she. Mr. Harris never complained. Not once. Not when the nurses ignored him, not when they spoke over him as if he weren't there, not even when they forgot to bring his meals on time. He just sat in silence, staring out the window, watching the world move on without him. Unlike the other patients, he had no visitors, no flowers, no cards, just a single tattered photograph on his bedside table. A young woman, smiling softly at the camera, her face slightly faded from time. Emily had asked him about it once, but he only gave her a tired smile and said, "Someone I used to know." He never asked for much. And yet, somehow, he was still treated as an inconvenience. It had started subtly. A nurse forgetting to check his vitals. A doctor rushing through his rounds without so much as looking at him. The orderlies speaking to him in clipped, impatient tones like he was wasting their time. But lately it had gotten worse. Emily noticed it when she arrived for her shift and found his dinner tray untouched at the foot of his bed. The food was cold, the juice spilled over the edge of the cup, soaking into the napkin. Her stomach twisted. "Did they not bring you your meal?" she asked softly. Mr. Harris gave a slow shake of his head. She glanced at the call button. It was just out of reach, pushed to the side like someone had knocked it away. Something inside her burned. She stormed out of the room, heading straight for the nurse's station. A few of them stood chatting by the desk, sipping coffee like they had no responsibilities in the world. When she approached, they barely looked at her. "Who was on rounds for room 306? She asked, her voice sharp. One of the nurses, a blonde woman named Karen, raised a brow. Why? Emily folded her arms. Because Mr. Harris didn't get his dinner? Karen let out a short, dismissive laugh. Maybe he wasn't hungry. Emily's jaw clenched. Or maybe someone just didn't bother bringing it to him. Another nurse, a younger man, snickered under his breath. Oh, come on. The guy barely eats anyway. What's the big deal? The big deal, Emily snapped, is that he's still a patient. And he deserves the same care as everyone else. Karen rolled her eyes. Look, if you want to be his personal nurse, be my guest. But don't come over here acting like we're the bad guys just because some old man didn't get his mashed potatoes. Emily felt the humiliation creep up her spine. The condescension in their voices, the way they looked at her like she was the problem. She took a slow breath. Then she turned on her heel and walked back to Mr. Harris's room. Come on, she said gently, helping him sit up. I'll get you something to eat. She took his untouched tray and marched to the break room, where she found a fresh meal, still warm. As she brought it back, she noticed Karen standing at the nurse's station, whispering something to another nurse. Both of them smirked when they saw Emily. The message was clear: you're making this harder on yourself. She ignored them. When she returned to Mr. Harris's room, she set the tray in front of him. They're not going to like you much if you keep this up, he murmured, his voice rough with age. Emily forced a smile. They don't have to like me. Mr. Harris just looked at her, his dark eyes tired but knowing. They're going to push back, he said quietly. Make it harder for you. She swallowed. Let them try. But she wasn't ready for what came next. The next day, she arrived at the hospital to find a note in her locker. Stop sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. The paper was folded neatly, slipped between her things like a warning. Her hands shook as she crumpled it. By the time she reached Mr. Harris's room, her anger was boiling. But when she stepped inside, her breath caught. His bed was pushed against the far wall. His things, what little he had, were gone. The photograph. The blanket she had brought him. His books. And in his place, an empty bed. Her heart pounded. What happened to Mr. Harris? She demanded at the nurse's station. Karen barely glanced up. Transferred. Emily's stomach dropped. Transferred where? Karen smirked, taking a sip of her coffee. Don't know. Don't care. Emily's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just neglect anymore. This was punishment. For her. For him. And she wasn't about to let them get away with it. Emily had barely recovered from the shock of Mr. Harris's sudden disappearance when the man in the dark gray suit appeared outside room 214. He stood there, composed, with an air of quiet authority, his gaze steady as he glanced over a file in his hands. When she approached, he looked up, his expression unreadable. Miss Reynolds? His voice was calm, professional. She hesitated. Yes? The man extended a hand. James Carter. I'm Mr. Harris's legal representative. Emily blinked. Mr. Harris had a lawyer? She had assumed he had no family, no close connections. No one had ever visited him. No one had cared enough to send a card or even ask about him. She swallowed, glancing at the now empty room. I didn't know he had a lawyer. Carter studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. Most people didn't. Something about the way he said it made her uneasy. I need to ask you a few questions, he continued, flipping open the file. You spent considerable time with Mr. Harris, didn't you? Emily folded her arms. I looked after him. Because no one else did? Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. And in that time, did he ever mention any financial matters? Any legal concerns? Emily frowned. Oh, why? Carter glanced down at his notes before responding. Mr. Harris had unfinished business. But I can't discuss the details just yet. A slow, creeping unease settled in her chest. What kind of unfinished business? Before Carter could answer, a sharp voice interrupted. Is there a problem here? Emily turned to see Dr. Whitmore approaching, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes flashing with irritation. Behind him, Karen stood by the nurse's station, watching like a vulture. No problem, Carter said smoothly, closing the file. Just discussing Mr. Harris's affairs. Whitmore's face barely changed, but Emily saw the way his fingers twitched against his clipboard. "Well," Whitmore said, his voice clipped, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't disrupt the staff. Miss Reynolds has work to do." Carter's gaze flickered between them before he gave a slow, polite nod. "Of course." But as he turned to leave, he handed Emily a crisp white business card. "In case you remember anything," he said quietly. She took it, her fingers closing around the smooth paper. As soon as he was gone, Whitmore turned to her, his smile thin and cold. "You seem to attract a lot of attention these days, Emily." She forced herself to meet his gaze. Mr. Harris deserved better. Whitmore tilted his head slightly. "And yet he's gone. And you're still here." Emily felt the sting of the words like a slap. Karen let out a soft chuckle from behind the desk. Emily turned without another word, shoving the business card into her pocket. But as she walked away, she could feel their eyes on her, heavy with unspoken threats. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the card. Something wasn't right. Mr. Harris had been ignored, neglected, treated like an afterthought. And yet, the moment he was gone, a lawyer showed up, and Whitmore was acting like she was the problem. She picked up her phone and dialed the number. Carter answered on the second ring. "I had a feeling you'd call." Emily took a breath. "Tell me what's really going on." There was a brief silence, then, "Meet me tomorrow. I think you need to know the truth about Mr. Harris." Mr. Harris was fading. Emily could see it in the way his hands trembled when he reached for his cup of water, in the way his breath came slower, more labored. His once strong presence, even in silence, was dimming, retreating into something quieter, something final. But there were changes too. Subtle ones. Sometimes she would catch him staring at the tattered photograph on his bedside table, not with the quiet longing he once had, but with something deeper, something heavier. Regret. It wasn't just sadness, it was the kind of sorrow that dug deep, the kind that made a person stare at the ceiling in the dead of night, wondering if they had done enough, if they had left too many things unsaid. One evening, long after most of the hospital had gone still, Emily sat beside him, adjusting his blanket, making sure he was warm. She was about to speak when he beat her to it. "Do you think people can make peace with their past?" His voice was rough, worn thin with age and exhaustion, but the weight behind his words was stronger than ever. Emily hesitated, caught off guard by the sudden depth of the question. "I think so," she said carefully. "I think it's never too late." Mr. Harris exhaled, a long, tired breath, his gaze drifting back to the photograph. "I don't know about that," he murmured. "Some things, some mistakes, they follow you." Emily leaned forward. "You still have time," she said gently. "If there's something you need to make right, you can." He gave a small, bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "Maybe in another life." Before she could ask what he meant, the door creaked open. "Karen." Emily's stomach twisted the second she saw the smirk on her face. "Visiting hours are over, Nurse Reynolds," Karen said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. Emily clenched her jaw. "He doesn't have visitors, Karen." Karen shrugged, stepping further into the room. "Then he doesn't need you hovering over him like some guardian angel, does he?" Mr. Harris closed his eyes, his face impassive. He was used to being dismissed. Emily wasn't. "I'll leave when I'm done," she said, her tone even. Karen's smirk widened. "Funny. That's not what Dr. Whitmore said." Emily's hands curled into fists at her sides. "You're not supposed to be here," Karen continued, tilting her head. "I mean, let's be honest, what's the point? The old man's on his way out. Might as well save your energy for someone who matters." The words hit like a slap. Emily glanced at Mr. Harris, expecting anger, expecting something. But he just lay there, his expression unreadable. Because he had heard it all before. Like it didn't even surprise him anymore. Emily turned back to Karen, her voice quiet but sharp. "Get out." Karen blinked, then let out a laugh. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Emily said, stepping closer. "You want to humiliate someone? Do it somewhere else." Karen's eyes flickered with something, anger, maybe even a hint of uncertainty, but it passed quickly. "Suit yourself," she said, rolling her eyes. "Just don't say I didn't warn you." With that, she sauntered out of the room, leaving nothing but the stench of her cruelty behind. Emily let out a slow breath, trying to push down the fury boiling in her chest. She turned back to Mr. Harris, expecting him to say something. But he only sighed, staring at the ceiling like he was somewhere else entirely. Like he had already given up. Emily wasn't sure which broke her heart more, his silence or the fact that he had been silenced for so long. She sat back down, gripping his hand gently. "You matter," she whispered. For the first time in days, his fingers curled weakly around hers. "Not much. Just enough." The night Mr. Harris passed, the hospital was unusually quiet. No beeping monitors, no distant voices, just the soft crackle of an old jazz record playing from the turntable Emily had borrowed from the nurse's lounge. The smooth hum of the saxophone filled the room, cutting through the sterile emptiness, making the space feel a little less lonely. Emily sat beside him, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, his breath growing fainter with each passing minute. His frail hands rested on the blanket, fingers twitching slightly as if reaching for something that wasn't there. She had seen death before. It was part of the job. But this felt different. He suddenly stirred, his lips parting as a weak, raspy whisper escaped. "Tell Lily I'm sorry." Emily's breath caught. His voice was so soft she almost thought she imagined it. "Who's Lily?" she asked gently, leaning in, desperate to keep him here just a moment longer. But Mr. Harris didn't answer. His tired eyes fluttered shut. His chest rose one final time, then stilled. Emily sat frozen, waiting, hoping for another breath that never came. The jazz record spun on, playing to a man who would never hear it again. She swallowed the lump in her throat and reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. "You're not alone," she whispered. But she was. The next morning, the hospital carried on as if nothing had happened. The nurses whispered about their weekends. Dr. Whitmore barely spared a glance in Emily's direction. Karen, of course, smirked when she saw the empty bed. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Emily clenched her fists, fighting the overwhelming urge to scream. Then she saw him. James Carter stood at the end of the hallway, watching her. His usual composed demeanor was tinged with something unfamiliar, solemnity. When she reached him, he handed her a sealed envelope. "He wanted you to have this," Carter said, his voice quiet. Emily hesitated before opening it, her fingers trembling. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Emily, thank you for seeing me when the world did not. Thank you for your kindness when kindness cost you something. I was a coward in life, and now, at the end, all I have are regrets. There is someone I should have faced a long time ago, but I was too afraid. Her name is Lily Parker. I have left something behind that belongs to her. You will know what to do." At the bottom of the letter, taped carefully in place, was a small key. A safety deposit box key. Emily looked up at Carter, confused. "What is this?" His expression was unreadable. "I think we should find out." The bank was a quiet, sterile place, the kind of place built for secrets. Inside the safety deposit box was a stack of neatly bound letters, yellowed with time, their edges worn but carefully preserved. Each envelope was addressed to the same name. Lily Parker. Emily ran her fingers over the letters, her chest tightening. "Who is she?" she murmured. Carter exhaled. "The woman in his photograph." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. He had spent his last days staring at this woman's picture, carrying a regret so heavy that it followed him to the grave. And now, she was holding the proof of it in her hands. "We need to find her," Emily said. It took a week of searching, but they found her. Lily Parker, now in her late 70s, lived in a small coastal town, far from the hospital where Mr. Harris had spent his last days. When Emily knocked on her door, an elderly woman with silver hair and deep brown eyes peered out at her, cautious but curious. "Can I help you?" Lily's voice was still strong, carrying the weight of a woman who had lived a long life. Emily took a breath. "I'm here about someone you used to know." Lily frowned. "Who?" Emily held out the letters. The moment Lily saw the name on the envelopes, her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she reached for them, eyes wide with something between shock and sorrow. She stared at the letters, silent for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I thought he forgot me." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. He never did. They sat together in Lily's small living room as she carefully opened the first letter, her hands shaking. For hours she read. Emily sat quietly, watching the way Lily's eyes glistened as she traced each word as if she could bring them back to life just by touching them. Finally, Lily exhaled, setting the last letter down. "He was my fiancé," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "We were going to be married." Emily's heart pounded. Lily wiped a tear from her cheek. "But there was a misunderstanding. Something happened. And we let it ruin us." She let out a shaky breath. "He left. I waited, but he never came back." Emily swallowed hard. "He wanted to. He was just afraid." Lily gave a small, sad smile. "I know." She looked at the letters once more, running her fingers over the faded ink. "For so many years, I hated him," she admitted. "But now," she sighed, shaking her head, "now I just miss him." Emily reached out, covering Lily's hand with hers. "He was sorry," Emily whispered. "He wanted you to know that." Lily squeezed her hand. And for the first time, Emily felt like Mr. Harris had finally been heard. Later that night, Carter met Emily outside the hospital, handing her a final document. "He left something else," he said. Emily frowned. "For Lily?" Carter shook his head. "For you." She hesitated before unfolding the paper. Her breath caught. It was a check. A large one. "He wanted you to go to medical school," Carter explained. "He knew you wanted more. And he wanted to make sure you had a chance." Emily felt her hands tremble. This wasn't just money. It was trust. It was a gift from a man the world had ignored. A man who had spent his final days believing he had nothing left to give, only to leave behind something greater than he ever imagined. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. She had only wanted to make sure Mr. Harris didn't die alone. But in the end, it was he who had given her a future she intended to make count.